Hi, I'm Tony Ross, Chair of BHBA's Inclusion Section, and I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today, Ashley Diffentorum. Ashley is an attorney at Kinsella, Hawley, Iser, Kump, and Stein Sapir, LLP, also known as KICS, the preeminent litigation boutique for entertainment, media, music, and IP matters. She handles a wide range of entertainment litigation, including breach of contract, copyright, and trademark infringement, as well as employment claims. Ashley also leads workplace investigations for companies responding to employee complaints of discrimination, harassment, and retaliation. She has also served as outside pro bono counsel for GLAAD, Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, a national organization with a mission to garner full acceptance of the LGBTQ plus community through accurate media representation. When she's not working, Ashley is active in the community and she is dedicated to public service and promoting diversity, including by volunteering at LGBTQ plus centers. And now let's get started. Welcome, Ashley.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you to everyone who's here today to listen on this presentation on LGBTQ plus allyship for legal professionals. As Tony mentioned, I'm an entertainment and business litigator at the firm of Kinsella, Hawley, Iser, Stein Sapir, or KICS for short. I also happen to be part of the LGBTQ plus community myself, and I live with my wife here in sunny Southern California. For me, saying that sentence out loud and being openly out is big because when I first became an attorney 8 years ago, I was still in the closet. I actually started working as a first year associate while also trying to balance the fact that I was secretly in a relationship with a woman for the first time. So my family didn't know, most of my friends didn't know, and certainly my colleagues didn't know at the time. Now, today, like as I said, I'm happily married to my wife, and I volunteered for several LGBTQ plus resource centers. And I've also served as outside pro bono counsel to GLAAD, which, if you don't know, it's a nonprofit organization that focuses on trying to get 100% acceptance of the community through accurate media representation in particular. But one of the main reasons that I got to this place where I feel so comfortable to just be and exist exactly as I am is because I was lucky enough to be surrounded by colleagues specifically who were effective allies. So my goal and hope with the presentation today is to pass on ultimately what those colleagues gave to me. I also want to take a moment kind of before I launch into everything to pause and really kind of frame the presentation around the phrase of effective allyship. So I think effective is kind of the key word there, right? I know there's a lot of people who want to support the community, who want to be an ally, but maybe they don't know how to do so effectively. Or maybe, maybe you have questions. Maybe you know some things already, but are open to learning more. I think this presentation is really for that group of people. So my purpose is to help transform kind of a general acceptance of the LGBTQ plus community into thoughtful, intentional allyship by providing tools in the form of key terminology and some concrete examples on how to be an effective ally. Hopefully that can then promote the facilitation of more, safe spaces so that everyone can feel safe and open to be themselves and live their true identity. So as I go over the material today, some of it may or may not be familiar to you. If it's not familiar to you, that's totally fine. And thank you for being here. I think it's a really important step towards effective allyship to, be here and learn. And for others, some of the material might be familiar to you. I think that's a good thing as well. That you could view this as a refresher and as a reminder that you also have the tools to help inform those in your social circles about how they can be an effective ally as well. Next slide, please. Perfect. So I wanted to go over the overarching kind of objectives of the presentation. So this presentation is really going to have three parts to it. So first, I'm going to discuss how effective allyship positively impacts interactions within the legal community in particular. Then I'm going to move into informing about some of the key language and terminology that's relevant to the LGBTQ plus community. And then lastly, I'm going to walk through some guidance on clear action steps to help facilitate a more inclusive workplace. So feel free to pose any questions that you have in the Q&A during the presentation. I am going to wait till the end, so I'll leave about 5 to 10 minutes at the end of the presentation to answer those questions. And then the last slide of the presentation is ultimately going to include my contact information. Please do not hesitate to contact me after if you have any further questions or want to discuss any of these topics further. I'm also, I'm open and eager to talk about this. So I want to make sure there's no hesitation to reach out afterwards if you have questions that we don't get to today. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this first topic I want to discuss is the importance of effective allyship in the legal community in particular. But before I dive into a few examples, I wanted to provide some data from some recent studies to help set the stage and kind of, highlight the importance of this discussion. So this slide shows Gallup polling data from 2024, which shows that over 23% of Gen Z, so that would have been ages 18 to 27, identify as being part of the LGBTQ plus community. The power of the internet really has given youth, the LGBTQ plus youth in particular, the means to more fully explore and kind of embrace their sexual orientations and their gender identities. They're also growing up in a culture that is, thankfully become increasingly more accepting of LGBTQ plus people, although obviously significant hurdles still exist. So what does all of this mean? It really just means that I highlight Generation Z or Gen Z in particular because it means that the growing workforce, which of course includes attorneys, is increasingly comprised of more and more people within that at least openly identify as being part of the LGBTQ plus community than ever before. Next slide, please. Thank you. And now, a study conducted by Edelman in partnership with GLAAD a few years ago found that across demographics, Americans are seeking out employers who take a stand in support of LGBTQ plus rights. So overall, US employees said that they are 4.5 times more likely to work at a company if it publicly supports and demonstrates a commitment to expanding and protecting the LGBTQ plus rights. And then sentiment is even a bit stronger amongst communities of color. So according to the data, the study showed, for example, that Black employees are 7 times more likely to work for a company that supports LGBTQ plus rights, and that Asian employees are 6.5 times more likely to want to work for those companies. Young people and women employees also show strong sentiment. So employees ages 18 to 34 are 5.5 times more likely to work for a company that supports LGBTQ plus rights. And then women employees are 5 times more likely to want to work for those companies. So a fully inclusive workplace can, obviously can be hard to find. So I think if you can be at the forefront of creating that workplace where everyone feels confident to be themselves and safe, most importantly, it can help draw people in to wanting to work at your organization and ultimately to staying and growing within it. I think practicing effective allyship is one way that you can help promote and facilitate this inclusive workplace. It can positively impact working relationships, honestly, in all industries, which of course, again, includes the legal industry in particular. But basically at a high level, effective allyship, what it does is it helps facilitate a safe space for those within the community where those people in turn feel more open, and that openness can also lead to more collaboration at the company as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so allyship can positively impact your relationships with your colleagues within your company or within your firm. And also, if you're outside counsel, it can help impact your relationship with in-house counsel and same vice versa. And then it can also help your relationship with opposing counsel. So I wanted to give some examples of how this might play out or what this might look like. So allyship can impact your relationship with colleagues within your own company if you're in-house or within your firm if you're an external. So let's assume, for example, that you're a transactional attorney. One of your colleagues happens to be a litigator, right? And they also happen to be part of the LGBTQ plus community, but you don't know that yet. So one day you're at lunch with the litigator and you bring up a hurdle that you're facing in a deal that you're working on. The litigator has some insight from a case they've worked on that might help you resolve the issue. But the way the litigator learned the insight was through litigation that involved LGBTQ plus issues in particular. So maybe in that situation, the litigator would opt not to share their insight out of a fear that you might make an uncomfortable joke or perpetuate an inaccurate stereotype of those that are within the community. Under those circumstances, if that were to play out and to happen, you would miss out on learning valuable information that could potentially resolve the dilemma that's in your deal. So had the litigator felt like they were in a safe space, they may have been more open with you, which again could have led to that collaboration piece. Now, as an example for kind of the second category, assume for a second that you're outside counsel. And let's say you represent a studio in connection with a contract dispute between the studio and a third party that supplies some sort of highly complex technology, right? The in-house attorney is your client, and they happen to be part of the LGBTQ plus community. But again, let's assume for these purposes that you don't know that. So it's not that the in-house counsel doesn't want to connect with you. Maybe they just fear that you might make a well-intentioned but uninformed or hurtful statement in response to the information. Or maybe they even fear that you'd no longer want to work with them if they were part of the LGBTQ plus community. Now, I want to pause here for a second to be very clear that people within the community, it's certainly not uncommon for them to have these types of fears, right? And that certainly does not always mean that you specifically have affirmatively, done or said anything wrong or anything that indicates how you might react. Instead, analyzing when it's safe, both emotionally and physically, to reveal non-heterosexual and or non-cisgender identities is truly just a scary and stressful reality that's faced by people within the community every day. I wanted to pause and point that out because as I go through some of these examples, I want to be clear, how and why I think these are such realistic examples, right? And to be clear that these fears and these stressors exist, even when you have not done anything to signal that you wouldn't support the community, right? So just to be aware of it. Okay, now back to the example. Let's say that in-house attorney at the studio, maybe they have a lot of familiarity with the complex technology that's at issue in the dispute because let's say their same-sex partner works in the technology industry. Under this example, if the in-house counsel, for whatever reason, feels uncomfortable or unsafe to reveal their identity, they might not share with you what they know about that technology. The internal thought process of the in-house attorney might go something like this. I'm not sure how this person is going to view me if I share that my partner is of the same sex as me. And I guess I could just call them my partner and keep the term gender neutral, so maybe they won't even realize that my partner is of the same sex as me. Oh no, but what if I say partner and they respond by assuming the wrong pronouns? Would I correct them? No, I wouldn't feel comfortable enough to correct them. So let's say a thought process like that goes on and the in-house attorney ultimately decides, I'm just going to stay silent about the fact I have any of this familiarity with this technology at issue because it's just easier than to have to, deal with the pressures that come with revealing the information. So this would, might mean that you miss out on reaping the benefits of that person's insight and knowledge on the technology issue. So again, in this circumstance, had that in-house attorney felt like they were in a safe space, they may have been willing to be open and share their knowledge about that technology, which again could have led to that beneficial collaboration. I'm moving into kind of this third bucket of how it can positively impact your dynamic with opposing counsel. Let's assume that you're working with opposing counsel to negotiate a deal. Maybe opposing counsel has, in fact, identified themselves to you as being part of the community, and you've shown some effective allyship to that person through some of the knowledge and tools that you'll learn later in this presentation. That, for example, could lead to more camaraderie throughout the deal process. So each of those examples highlight the importance of effective allyship within the legal community in particular. And then the question I think that naturally follows from that is, how do I be an effective ally, right? So the purpose of the rest of the presentation is really to give you those tools necessary to be an effective ally. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so I'm moving into now the second portion, which is the key language and terminology portion of this presentation. I think an important part of being an effective ally is to learn about some of the key language and the terminology relevant to the community. So things like what do the letters all stand for, and which initialism do I use, and what's the difference between trans and non-binary? I'm going to aim to answer all of these questions kind of in this portion of the presentation. So to start, I think it's important to recognize the difference between these three phrases that you see on this slide. The first being sexual orientation, the next gender identity, and gender expression. So this is one of my favorite slides in the presentation because I saw it during a meeting I attended with the GLAD board, and it really helped me to better understand the differences between this important technology. So first, sexual orientation refers to kind of think who I fall in love with, right? It's the L, the G, and the B letters within the LGBTQ plus initialism. And then there's gender identity, which is something different than sexual orientation, right? So gender identity refers to who I am. Think the T or trans within LGBTQ plus. Gender identity is determined when I look within myself and determine who I am. And then there's gender expression, which is how I present myself to the world. So it's important to remember that neither sexual orientation nor gender identity is visible to others. I'm going to say that one more time because I think it's super important. So neither sexual orientation, so who I fall in love with, nor gender identity, which is who I am, is visible to others. It's really only gender expression that's visible to others. And again, I like this slide because I think it helps to dispel some harmful assumptions that can sometimes be made about people within the community. For example, it's important to remember that trans and non-binary people have sexual orientations too, right? So just because someone is a trans woman, for example, does not necessarily mean that she falls in love with men. Next slide, please. Okay, so I wanted to go over kind of what do the letters stand for, right? So L stands for lesbian. It's an adjective that's used to describe a woman whose enduring attraction is to other women, sorry. Stands for gay. It's an adjective that's used to describe a person whose enduring attraction is to people of the same sex. The B stands for bisexual. It's an adjective that's used to describe a person who has the potential to be attracted to people of more than one gender, not necessarily at the same time, in the same way, or to the same degree. I'm going to pause on this for a second to take a moment to talk about how important understanding this terminology is. So, as a personal anecdote, I identify as bisexual. I've always known since I was very little that I'm attracted to people of more than one gender. And really, up until I was about 24, I really only dated men. It was never a question in my mind who I had the potential to be romantically and emotionally attracted to. But what I did have a question about was the definition of bisexual, and therefore I had really had no idea how to vocalize who I am to others, right? So my confusion stemmed from the false assumption that all bisexual people are attracted to more than one gender to the same exact degree, right? When I was 24, I began dating a woman for the first time. And when that relationship ended a couple of years later, I naturally began going on dates with other people. When I went on a date with a woman that went well, I would often hear questions from curious, well-intentioned friends, such as, "Are you sure you're not just a lesbian?" Now, those types of questions, while I understood they were just curious, they were harmful and a little bit confusing. Not confusing because I didn't know who I had the potential to be attracted to, but because I didn't know how to vocalize it, particularly when people around me operated under that false assumption that all bisexual people are attracted to more than one gender to the same degree, right? So that assumption is just not accurate. Some bisexual people may be attracted to all genders equally, others may not. And then relatedly, just because someone has the potential to be attracted to people of more than one gender does not mean that attraction occurs at the exact same time, right? And then also the term bisexual is also used as kind of an umbrella term to include people that are also pansexual, which describes a person who has the potential to be attracted to people of any gender, not necessarily at the same time, in the same way, or to the same degree. Now, the T in LGBTQ stands for trans. It is an adjective that's used to describe a person whose gender identity differs from the sex that they were assigned at birth. As I mentioned earlier, gender identity is not visible. So that means that being transgender is not dependent on physical appearance or medical procedures. And I'll touch on all of that a little bit more later. The Q stands for queer or questioning. It's an adjective that's used to describe a person who is not exclusively heterosexual. So typically, for those people who identify as queer, the terms lesbian, gay, and bisexual are perceived to be a bit too limiting and or fraught with cultural connotations that they feel don't apply to them. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, in addition to the initials of LGBT and Q, you may sometimes use additional initials to describe the community, such as 2S, I, and A. So I wanted to go over those as well. 2S stands for two-spirit. It's an adjective that's used by some Indigenous and First Nations people as an umbrella term to describe a person who is not exclusively heterosexual and or cisgender. So that term should not be used to describe people who are not Indigenous, right? And then we only use this term for an Indigenous person if they use it to describe themselves. I stands for intersex, which is an adjective used to describe a person with one or more innate sex characteristics, including genitals, internal reproductive organs, and chromosomes that fall outside of the traditional concepts of male or female bodies. Now, the A's can stand for asexual or aromantic. So, asexual in particular is an adjective that's used to describe someone who doesn't experience sexual attraction. It is also used as an umbrella term to include people that are demisexual, which describes a person who does experience some sexual attraction, but only after forming a strong emotional connection with the partner. Now, aromantic is an adjective used to describe a person who does not experience romantic attraction. It's also used as an umbrella term to include people that are demi-romantic, which describes someone who does experience some romantic attraction, but only after forming a strong sexual connection with a partner. So with all that, you might be asking, which initialism do I use? And I know within the community, different initialisms are used. So fewer initials were initially included. I didn't plan to say few initials were initially included, but there we go. So at first it was kind of, I think, just LGBT to start, and it has really expanded over time to account for and acknowledge the existence of a broader array of people and of experiences, right? So I will say that some prominent national organizations aimed at furthering acceptance within the community, such as GLAAD, for example, and I believe the Trevor Project as well, use LGBTQ initialism. Now, others might use LGBTQ plus, LGBTQIA plus, LGBTQ2S, and there's even some others as well. Personally, I like to use LGBTQ plus just to signify and acknowledge that there are experiences that don't fall neatly within the stated initials, including experiences that might not currently be defined at all, right? So I like to include that plus just personally as that reminder that there's additional terms outside of these letters and that there's always room to add more vocabulary. And, kind of as you can probably tell based on the terminology and information just discussed, not everyone's experience within the community is the same. So this community encompasses a very broad array of people and identities. And within that broad array of identities is intersectionality, meaning that there's systems, of inequality and oppression that intersect and create unique effects and experiences for certain people within the community. So I think it's important to acknowledge that not everyone's experience within the community is the same. Now, with that being said, I want to shift to a discussion about trans and non-binary people in particular. So unfortunately, I think trans and non-binary people in particular are currently under, frankly, just under attack. So there's been a record-breaking number of bills and laws in recent years across states that target trans and non-binary people. So I really do believe that now more than ever before, it's important to try to understand some key language and terminology about trans and non-binary people in order to help dispel some of the negative and frankly just false assumptions about trans and non-binary people. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so to help lay a foundation and kind of kick off this discussion, I'd like to go over this slide with you, which shows gender diversity by laying out the difference between biological sex, gender identity, and gender expression. So biological sex refers to sex that a doctor assigns you at birth based on genitals and chromosomes. So biological sex refers to what the doctor writes down on a piece of paper after looking at you when you're born to determine whether you're male or female. Now, I'm admittedly, not a doctor and science is not my background, but my general understanding is that this decision that the doctor makes about biological sex is actually not always as obvious or clear as it may otherwise seem. And this line, kind of here, this first line under biological sex, it identifies male on one end, female on the other end, and intersex in the middle, is actually a bit more of a spectrum. Now, gender identity, again, it's the who I am, it also operates on a spectrum. So at one end of the spectrum is identifying as a man, and at the opposite end is identifying as a woman, and then somewhere near the middle is non-binary. Gender expression refers to how I present myself to the world through pronouns, for example, hair, clothes, etc. And that can be discussed in the context of a spectrum as well. So masculine being at one end of the spectrum and feminine being at the other. And then non-conforming being somewhere there near the middle. Now, this slide is not comprehensive by any means of how people describe or define themselves. I'm just using it to help promote awareness of gender diversity. And then again, each of these lines represents a spectrum. So if a person is neatly lined up on the edges of these lines here, meaning, for example, let's say that the doctor assigned them at birth, the sex the doctor assigned them at birth matches their gender identity and their gender expression, then that person is cisgender. So there are people, however, that are not neatly lined up on the edges of these spectrums. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so here's a list of some terms that exemplify gender diversity in particular. So cisgender is an adjective used to describe a person whose gender identity matches the sex that they were assigned at birth. Now, transgender is an adjective used to describe someone whose gender identity differs from the sex that they were assigned at birth. Non-binary is an adjective used to describe a person whose gender identity and/or gender expression falls outside of the binary gender categories of man and woman. The term non-binary, by the way, is also used as, again, kind of like an umbrella term that encompasses many different ways to understand one's gender. So some non-binary people may also use words like agender, bigender, demigender, pangender, etc. to describe the specific way in which they're non-binary. Now, gender fluid is an adjective that's used to describe a person whose gender identity is not static, meaning that it does not necessarily remain the same over time. Next slide, please. Okay, so there's several misconceptions about trans and non-binary people, so I put together this slide to help explain some of them. The first misconception is that no trans people are non-binary and that no non-binary people are trans. But that's simply not true, right? So the second misconception is that all non-binary people are also trans, but that not all trans people are non-binary. That's also false. The truth looks more like on the far right? So it's a little bit more of a Venn diagram where some but not all trans people are non-binary and some but not all non-binary people are trans. And it's important to remember that none of these diagrams are to scale, right? So an example of someone who uses the adjective of non-binary to describe themselves but does not identify as trans may be using non-binary to describe their gender expression and not necessarily their gender identity. Now, I wanted to dedicate some time to answer kind of that important question of when is a person transgender? Because I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there about that topic in particular. There may, and I want to be clear that there may or may not be a medical, a social, or a legal aspect associated with being transgender. But I think it's important to understand that transgender people may or may not go through a medical transition, right? And they may or may not tell anyone in their social circles. They also may or may not legally change their name or their gender markers. A person is not transgender when they go through a medical transition, when they tell anyone, or when they take any legal action to change their name. So when is a person transgender? They're transgender the moment that they know they are. And by the way, this applies to everyone within the community. So someone is in the community the moment they know themselves to be, right? This is another point that, as I put together the presentation, kind of makes me sigh in relief. Because if you told me, for example, that I'm only bisexual after I tell people, my head would spin. I'm constantly telling people that I'm part of the community, right? In fact, I just told all of you a few minutes ago, and I'll always have to inform new people about my identity if I want them to know it, because the current default assumption in society is heterosexuality. So, key takeaway, if you remember nothing else from the presentation, is that you do not need to understand an identity in order for it to exist, right? So everyone exists at a different level of experience and knowledge on any given topic, and that includes knowledge on the LGBTQ plus community. Honestly, personally, I had very little knowledge about the community before just a few years ago, and I'm continuing to learn today. Yet, just because we may have never heard of a certain experience or identity before doesn't mean that it never existed. I think what's important is that as effective allies, we put in the effort to understand and accept everyone and their identities. And most importantly, that when someone tells us who they are or about their experiences, that we believe them. Now, beyond learning the key language and terminology applicable to the community, I want to give you some examples of clear action steps that you can take to be an effective ally. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as I previewed earlier, this is, or I don't know if I said it actually, but this is truly my favorite part of the presentation. And in fact, the source of my excitement and passion for putting this presentation together, which is really the fact that it has become more clear to me through my day-to-day interactions that a lot of people have good intentions and that they want to support the community, but nonetheless, inadvertently say or do things that can be hurtful to those within the community. And although it may sound like, an easy solution to just have people within the community gently remind another person when something is said or done that hurts them, I think ultimately that puts an unfair layer of responsibility, burden, and stress onto the shoulders of the person within the community. So to help try to avoid that, I want to walk you through a list of kind of do's and don'ts, so to speak. It's a list of relatively small and simple steps that you can take in order to create a big and a positive impact on the community. So, the first action step you can take to be an effective ally is to use inclusive language. There are words that we are accustomed to using in our everyday language that exclude certain groups of people within the community. So, the goal in being intentional about using inclusive language is to signal to those within the community that they're seen and that their existence is acknowledged. So, with that said, it's important to use inclusive language across all the communications in your workplace. So this would include written and verbal communication, regardless of whether those communications are one-on-one or in group conversations. And then inclusive language could also be used or should also be used in company policies and job postings as well. So examples of non-inclusive phrases include men and women, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, his or hers, and you guys. All of these phrases exclude the identities of certain groups of people within the community, including, for example, non-binary people. And instead of using those terms, you could be, more intentional about using inclusive phrases, such as those listed on the right, which include everyone, colleagues, people, team, there, you all, or it's not on this slide, but I think y'all also works. I know we're in California, not in Texas, but could be acceptable to say y'all as well. Now, again, the purpose of using this inclusive language is really just to acknowledge that there are far more gender identities than simply man and woman. So I just went over some of those identities with you earlier in the presentation, and I know there's a lot there. As a society, I think our historical understanding of these gender identities has expanded over time, but as I mentioned before, that doesn't mean that these gender identities didn't previously exist. So by being intentional about using inclusive language, you can help create a more inclusive environment that feels safer to those that are within the LGBTQ plus community. And I can tell you from firsthand experience that this language doesn't only make non-binary and gender non-conforming people feel more comfortable, but it can also make everyone in the community as a whole feel more comfortable. So, for example, I'm a woman, and yet when I hear, I'm a cisgender woman, and yet when I hear people use this inclusive language, honestly, I instantly feel safer to be myself around that person because I think it signals to me that the person cares and that they're being intentional and purposeful about allowing others to feel included as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. So additional non-inclusive phrases include maternity leave and paternity leave. Those phrases can exclude certain sexual orientations and gender identities. So instead, you could try using phrases such as parental leave or parental time off. And then relatedly, I know it's not up on this slide, but in the workplace setting in particular, there's also a growing trend, I think, to substitute the term father with the inclusive term of non-birthing parent. Now, further, if you know that one of your colleagues has a significant other, but you haven't heard yet how they refer to their partner, you could avoid assuming that the correct description of the partner is husband, wife, girlfriend, or boyfriend, and instead use inclusive terms like partner or spouse to ensure that you're not making erroneous assumptions about anyone's sexual orientation or gender identity. Additionally, I think pronouns are one of the many ways that people express their gender, right? So, for example, people who identify as men might use the pronouns he, him, his, and people who identify as women might use the pronouns she, her, and hers. Non-binary people may also use these pronouns, or they may not. And then some non-binary people may use gender-neutral pronouns such as they and them. Ultimately, around pronouns, I think you should avoid asking others for their pronouns to avoid that, kind of awkward situation where you're putting them in that uncomfortable position where they feel like they're forced to respond. Instead, you could try offering your pronouns. So, for example, I'm Ashley, I use she, her pronouns. And then you could pause to see if they opt to share their pronouns with you. And then if they don't share their pronouns with you, or if you otherwise just don't know someone's pronouns, you could use inclusive terms to refer to them, such as you, they, or employee in the communications. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, you also want to avoid language that suggests that being part of the LGBTQ plus community is a choice. So, for example, although your initial instinct may be to say that a person prefers the use of they, them pronouns, the use of that word prefer implies that there's a choice in the matter, while many people believe that it's not a choice to be referred to by the pronouns that best reflect their gender identity. And then also, it would help to avoid using the outdated phrase of sexual preference. That phrase implies a preference or a choice in the matter, which can alienate many people within the LGBTQ plus community. Instead, the correct phrase there would be sexual orientation. Other accurate and inclusive phrases could also include gender identity and gender expression, which we went over earlier in the presentation. I wanted to pause here for a moment to kind of answer the question I know I've had a lot of, which is what happens if I make a mistake, right? So for example, what do you do if you use the wrong pronouns or you assume the wrong gender of one of your colleagues' partners? I think really the best way to handle it is to acknowledge the mistake, to apologize, and to move on. And while I think you should acknowledge and, apologize for the mistake, I also don't think you want to dwell on it, right? So saying something like, oh no, I'm a horrible person for saying that, and I feel so terrible. I know I'm the worst. I don't think something like that's particularly helpful. I think it actually puts the LGBTQ plus person in a position where they're kind of now having to comfort you for the mistake instead of, yeah, and I just think that can be an uncomfortable situation overall. Instead, a simple, hey, I recognize I just called you by the wrong pronoun. I'm really sorry about that. I'm gonna do it correctly moving forward. I think that's sufficient and that works. And I know it takes, I understand that it may take some time to become accustomed to using more inclusive language, but I don't think that means we shouldn't try, right? And again, these are some relatively small and simple steps that you can take in order to create a big and a positive impact on the community. Next slide, please. Okay. So in addition to using inclusive language, another action step of effective allyship is to hold space instead of asking questions. So I know the terminology of holding space is very popular, but you may or may not know what that means. Essentially, I think, holding space means to listen without judgment, without bias, and without preconceived ideas of what the person's going to say. So ultimately, I think it means to practice that empathy and compassion and to just, accept someone's truth no matter what that truth is. Now, when I suggest holding space for your colleagues, I mean to allow room for them to provide information about themselves to you if they so choose. If and when they do provide information to you about their gender identity or sexual orientation, I think it's best to listen, without that judgment, the bias, or the preconceived ideas. So I wanted to talk a little bit about invasive questions. Candidly, I can give you a long list of examples because I personally have experienced countless instances where friends, and again, well-intentioned people, ask me invasive questions about my sexual orientation. Um, but before I give some examples of those invasive questions, I want to acknowledge that it's human and common to be curious about those who have a different experience than you, right? And I don't think that curiosity is a bad thing. In fact, I think it's a really good thing. Presumably, it's your curiosity about the community that even brought you to this presentation, for example, in the first place. And obviously, I think that's a great thing, right? So there's a number of harmless and great ways, though, I think that you can satisfy that curiosity, that doesn't involve asking invasive questions to people within the community, right? So this presentation is obviously one of the ways you can do that. And then beyond attending presentations like this, you could uh, run Google searches, you could find books on the topic, you could listen to podcast episodes. I know I, for example, listened to a few podcast episodes and even preparing this presentation today. So there's certainly plenty of options out there of ways that you can satisfy that curiosity and to learn more. Um, Now, a harmful way, I think, to satisfy that curiosity about the community is to ask the invasive questions. And this is particularly true or particularly inappropriate and unhelpful in the workplace specifically. So examples of some invasive questions, which again are things not to ask in the workplace, would include, so if a colleague comes out to you, it would include questions like, how long have you known? Are you sure? But didn't you date so and so? Did you even like them? Those are some examples in that context. And then when an LGBTQ plus colleague tells you that they're getting married, examples of some invasive questions, again, things not to ask, would include things like, well, which one of you are going to wear the dress and which one of you will wear a suit or, but how will you have kids? Right? So those types of questions can make people that are in the community feel very uncomfortable even if they respond to you and even if they otherwise seem to not be offended by the question, right? So in fact, particularly in the workplace setting, the LGBTQ plus person might feel obligated to respond and act like they're not hurt by the question that you're asking, right? So, but ultimately, I think if you're in doubt about whether a question will be offensive to your colleague, I think it's best to not ask the question. And instead, you could feel free to, again, Google about your curiosity or find books or podcasts or other presentations on the topic. I also want to take a moment to say that I wholeheartedly believe that just by holding space for someone in the LGBTQ plus community, that over time, the things that you're curious about will naturally be answered without you having to pose those questions. So it's also important to remember that there are so many things to talk about with your LGBTQ plus colleagues that don't involve asking invasive questions about either about their sexual orientations or their gender identities. For example, if you're in the lunchroom with them, you can talk to them about lunch, about their weekend plans. If you're in the library, which I don't know which firms or companies still have libraries, but so be it. Then you can talk about books, just talking about the environment around you, could work as an option, right? Their gender identity and sexual orientation ultimately is not the only thing there is about them for you to be able to learn about and relate to, right? And in fact, I mentioned that while conducting research for this presentation, I had listened to some podcasts. One of the podcasts I listened to, I wanted to share a story I heard from it. So it was about a trans man who had shared his experience about being the only trans person in his high school. He explained that overall, his classmates and his teachers were very supportive. They addressed him by his correct pronouns. They avoided asking him invasive questions like whether he was going to medically transition. So overall, ultimately, they did, a really good job of doing many of the things I kind of suggest and walk through in this presentation. But he also shared that the most memorable and impactful thing that had happened to him was actually when a classmate went to Cancun for the summer and returned to class in the fall with a gift for him of, I think it was like an iguana keychain. So the classmate basically had noticed that he drew iguanas quite a bit in art class and said that the keychain reminded them of him. So when I listened to this podcast, this man was crying while recalling the story and emphasized how much it meant to him to be known as someone beyond just the trans kid in school, right? So someone saw him, his interests, and that he, just like all of us, is a human who has interests too. I wanted to share that example because I think it's a good one and fits well here in this kind of reminder of, we have this curiosity as humans. It's not a bad thing. It can be a good thing, but there's places to draw from it and to remember that your colleagues who are part of the community are also, whole people that have other things that you can talk to them about as well, beyond just sexual orientation or gender identity. So when a colleague comes out to you, instead of asking invasive questions like how long have you known or are you sure, you could do something like you could congratulate them. You could thank them for sharing the information with you. And of course, you could offer your support. And the way you could offer support is by saying something like, even just as simple as, I want you to know that I support you, right? It's a very simple phrase, but it can go a long way. You could also inform your colleague about maybe any resources that your company makes available, your company or your firm, that they make available to people within the LGBTQ plus community. Okay. Now, I wanted to end on a note of a personal story of thank you for changing the slide, by the way. So I want to take a moment to share my story of the very first time that I came out to a colleague and the effective allyship that was shown to me in return. So I previewed at the beginning of this presentation that it's because of my interactions with effective allies in the workplace that I am where I am today, where I'm so comfortable being out and being myself. But let's rewind to kind of, 8 years ago, shortly after I'd begun dating a woman for the first time. Now, overall, that relationship was pretty much a secret. Only a handful, certainly not all, of my friends knew about the relationship. I had not yet informed my family about the relationship at the time, or even about my sexual orientation, because I knew, there was going to be some rejection there, and I didn't want to experience that at the time. My then girlfriend didn't tell a single person on her end about her sexual orientation or about our relationship. So as you can imagine, we both experienced, all of the typical ups and downs of really any relationship. But then on top of that, we were very seriously struggling just to accept ourselves. And I think we both felt alone with not a lot of support to lean on or people to confide in. But I did have a mentor at work at the first firm I worked at who I was pretty close with. And I had noticed at this point, where this story takes place, I had noticed her effective allyship. So, for example, she would make it a purpose to use inclusive terms. Um, and it just showed me kind of it was certainly something I was cueing into and paying a lot of attention to as I was trying to assess my environments and figure out who might be safe to talk to, right? Because the stress of keeping everything a secret, it was really bubbling up and it was getting very difficult. So I was a little bit desperate in a way to try to figure out who was safe, where would it be safe, because I knew at some point I was going to need people as a resource. But one day, ultimately, at a one-on-one lunch with that mentor, she could tell that I was having a hard time, just in general, and she asked how I was doing overall. I felt safe, so I pretty quickly blurted out, I have a girlfriend and no one really knows about it. And that's all I said at first. She looked at me dead in the eyes with a very nice smile on her face and tears in her eyes and said, thank you so much for telling me. I feel honored to know. Is there anything I can do to support you? I told her that not many people, that no one really knew about that relationship with my then girlfriend and that it was difficult and scary for me to navigate. To which, she responded by informing me that my, then firm that I was working at, that they had an affinity group of LGBTQ plus attorneys, and that I could and, should, if I felt comfortable, consider joining the group to connect with and lean on other people that might have similar experiences to me. She did not push me to join the group. She didn't pressure me in any way. But instead, she let me know that it existed and said that she would happily introduce me to the leader of the group so that I could seamlessly join it if I wanted to. But really, her effective allyship didn't end there in the conversation. So I responded truthfully by telling that mentor of a very real and scary fear that I had at the time. So with my voice kind of shaking and kind of in shell shock, I told her that I feared that if I joined the group and that my relationship with my then girlfriend ended, which it was rocky, so I didn't know it was going to end, that I might end up dating a man at some other later point in time. I told her that I was fearful that if I dated a man afterwards, I would feel like or be perceived as a fraud who doesn't belong in the affinity group. She again looked at me in the eyes and said, Ashley, there's a B in LGBTQ plus for a reason, and it's not who you're dating that defines who you are. Now, those words might seem basic and straightforward, right? Especially in the context of all of the information I just shared during this presentation. But at the time, that information was groundbreaking for me. It was life-changing, truly. It set me on a path towards ultimately accepting myself. And I really don't think I'd be as comfortable with myself as I am today. It's certainly not at that time without her showing that effective allyship. So that compassion and that support that she showed me during that conversation is something I'm always going to be grateful for. And I share that story in hopes that it gives some insight into just how impactful effective allyship in the workplace can be on people within the LGBTQ plus community. So thank you all very much for listening to the presentation. And here's, contact information if you have any more questions. And then I think now we have a couple of questions in the Q&A. So I am going to go through them. First, I have one that asks, can you please share some of the best resources for people who want to learn more about the experiences of LGBTQ plus people? For example, Erin in the Morning, who does some of the best, most comprehensive reporting on the legislative and policy onslaught forcing trans kids and adults effectively out of public life. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for that question. First of all, and thank you for also sharing the Erin in the Morning. Looks like it's erininthemorning.com. I think it's a helpful resource I honestly didn't even know about. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I certainly think seeking out those types of resources are super important and can be very helpful. I think that one that was just mentioned is a great one to check out. I personally, again, because of the connection with GLAAD, I'm used to GLAAD will publish again, they're focused on garnering acceptance of the community through accurate media representation. So I really enjoy, finding the movies and the television shows and the podcasts that are listed on their website as being, having acknowledgments towards the community and accurately representing the community and watching them. It's also fun, right? To find, at least for me, as I love film and television, to find a good film that, as part of the storyline happens to include LGBTQ plus people and their stories And that's something I've loved. So I know that's a resource as well. But certainly encourage all of you to, share resources with each other. I think that's super helpful. And then we have another question that asks, so it says gender neutral terms for mom, dad, grandmother, grandfather, sister, brother, or parents, grandparents, and siblings. What about daughter, son? I use offspring, but is there something else that can be used? That's a very that's a very good question. I like where your head's at. I like that you're thinking of the other terms here. I think for children, I mean, children, child, kid, I think that all works. I know it might sound a little bit odd if they're older to call them a child, um, but I certainly, I think those can work. I have to give that some more thought as well. But I also wanted, this reminds me, I wanted to say, because I know there's sometimes some talk, or at least I've heard from, again, well-intentioned people about um, again, this is not the question, but sometimes there can be a little bit of focus on it can be awkward to use the pronouns they, them. And I did want to give an example. I heard this talked about again in the context of working with GLAD. I forget who it was, but someone there did a really good talk on it one time where a lot of these words, I know it takes the intention to think about it before you make a decision whether to say my son or my daughter or my child or my offspring. Um, but a lot of the terminology we do use. So in the example of they, them, for example, it's not new for us to call people by a plural pronoun when we're referring to one person. Like that's just not a new thing, right? So I know we're virtual for this presentation, but for example, if we were in person right now and someone left their cell phone on the desk and I had no idea who left the cell phone, even before trying to really think about and focus on this terminology, I think I'd naturally say, uh-oh, someone left their cell phone here. Does anybody know who they were? Like, I think that sometimes I don't know if that's helpful, but it was helpful for me to realize and kind of have that example explained to me of sometimes this terminology isn't all that different of what we're used to. But I love that question about how do you refer to daughter or son? But I think offspring, like you mentioned, works. I think child works. Um, yeah, I can keep thinking of others too. Okay, and then we have a question here. I'm more interested in putting LGBTQ clients at ease. That's great. As a family law attorney who often interviews clients remotely by phone or online, our clients often had name changes like John, aka Jane. We need to know this for paperwork purposes, but clients are often embarrassed about disclosing this up front. What can we post on our website or in our intake to put these clients at ease rather than us finding out later from either opposing party or opposing counsel? Should we be blunt about the request or is there a more subtle way to request this info? We already asked for formally used names in our intake, but that doesn't seem to work well. That's a very thoughtful question, and thank you for posing it. I haven't thought about that specific issue because I'm not in the family law space and doing it, but in kind of thinking off of the top of my head, I think I'm a big fan of, well, first of all, I'm an overthinker just in general, like for better or worse, I just am. So I tend sometimes when I'm worried about something just to say it up front. So for example, if it's in the questionnaire of, hi, have you had any, like as a question, have you had any name changes? And then something like putting in parentheses, the purpose of what you need to know. Like, or telling them, if you have, I think the conversation might be a little bit easier depending, but it can be easy, if you're one-on-one with them, like, hey, I know this is a strange question, but for purposes, this is why we need it because of X, Y, Z. Could you share, even going, it's ridiculous, we need this. I get that. But here's the process. Here's a little bit behind the curtain and why I'm asking. I think sometimes even just giving a little bit of that context is super helpful. I'm sorry if that doesn't, get you to exactly what you wanted, but just in thinking off the top of my head, I certainly think it could be perhaps helpful to show a little bit behind the curtain of why instead of just, did you have a name change, which could put someone on their heels, understandably, right? But I like the question. Okay.
Ashley, it looks like we actually have one question from our email help desk, if that's all right.
Yep.
Um, so the question being, I've wanted to support a colleague whose child is trans. Is there anything specific I can do to be supportive when there are so many attacks on the trans community?
Yeah, I love that question. And again, I love that all of you care. It makes me really happy. Um, I think. I think offering, again, it goes similar. I know it's not your colleague that's part of the community, but it's your colleague's child. I mean, first of all, I think that's great that they obviously felt comfortable to share the information with you or to a point where it got to you, and I think that's really cool. I would still, though, if it comes up in the conversation from the other person, I think just giving them any support that they need or asking if there's anything you can do. Um, I certainly wouldn't go, I know it can be tempting because you're obviously, you care about these things to go, I heard about this resources or how do you, I wouldn't suggest going to hand them resources. I would suggest kind of, again, holding that space, talking to that colleague as normal as you would what the weekend's like and other things, not prying too much into any questions about their child, but instead kind of leaving that open. And then if the topic comes up, if they share with you, or if they're talking about it again, or if they're saying I'm struggling with this, or I'm just trying to support them right now, even just saying sometimes I know I'm not part of the trans community, but sometimes for me, even just if I don't know someone very well and they're like, it's tough times like that, it's so weird because it seems so surface level. I know people want to do more, but that can really help too. Um, so ultimately, I think again, waiting or if the colleague comes to you and there's a natural way into the conversation, they're certainly letting them know that you support them and even asking or saying, I really want to support. Is there anything I can do to support you? Like if the topic is already coming up and saying that I think would be appropriate, but I would try to avoid just, approaching them out of the blue where you're talking about something else and then saying, hey, what I saw these resources, or why don't you take a look at this? Like, I think ultimately the same rules kind of apply of it being best of holding that open space and letting them come to you and then letting them know you support them and asking if there's anything you could do to help.
Right, it looks like that's it for questions today. Thank you so much, Ashley, for a fantastic presentation today. And thank you so much to our audience for joining us. Have a great day, everybody.
Like, thank you for having me.